Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to our corporate series. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs here at the Korea Society. And thank you for joining us for this discussion with our guest, Donald Southerton. Don is the CEO of Bridging Culture Worldwide and author of Korea Perspective. He heads Bridging Culture Worldwide. It's a Golden, Colorado-based company that provides strategy and consulting and training to Korea-based global businesses. Don has over 35 years of professional experience in the automotive, retail, golf, land development sectors. And we're really looking forward to having a conversation with him on his experience and the book and Korean businesses overall. So thanks for joining us,
Well, I
Don.
enjoy being back here at the Korea Society and sharing with you my experiences as they've unfolded over the years.
Right. So you've been consulting Korean companies for over 35 years. How has your current work evolved and changed over those years?
I think initially my work was focusing on supporting the major Korean companies, the chaebol as they had expanded internationally. Naturally, they were the large and are the large groups that many of us are very familiar with, and those brands. They had tremendous resources, and the work originally was to help support them in their overseas operations. What, by that I mean I would be working with their non-Korean teams to better explain Korean culture, the Korean workplace, and how the Korean companies operate. The shift has been twofold, really. In the last 10 years, more and more work is supporting non-Korean companies that are doing business with Korean companies.
Mm.
So, for example, if you look at any of the major Korean products out there today, whether it's the media side or the any support that's needed by these Korean companies as they've moved into other markets, these non-Korean companies want that business. They want to secure that business, and they want to maintain that. So they realize that they need to better understand how a Korean company operates. And the third thing has been as Western brands have entered into Korea. The original market entry for Korean brands were, let's say, Starbucks, for example, was a joint venture with Shinsegae in Korea. There are many non-Korean brands that are looking at going into the Korean market, and as part of their due diligence and part of their market entry strategy, they realize they need support to go into that market.
Mm. So with the growth of these non-Korean companies wanting to work more closely with Korean companies, do you see this movement really based on the success of companies like Samsung, LG, and other leading Korean global corporations?
Sure, and I think one thing that we have to see is that, and you just have to look at something like the Oscars, or you look at Super Bowl, you see the number of Korean brands. That product that you're seeing there is U.S. produced. I mean, so that's U.S. media companies and a multitude of companies that are supporting those efforts. And so, we're talking huge dollars involved here, and so I think that's that sensitivity of these companies. They want that business, and so they're willing to go and really invest in better understanding who that Korean client is. And it's really, I've actually had some companies that they'll secure a major Korean contract, and the first thing they do is reach out to me and say, "Hey, we realize that this is different. We've never dealt with a Korean company before, so we want to be able to better understand them."
Right, right. Now, given how sophisticated Korea has become over the years, how has your understanding, or how has that informed your work or changed the work of understanding corporate business culture in the Korean context?
Well, it's changed tremendously, and one way I think that we look at the Korean economy has been very export driven for decades. The business model for Korea is basically an export driven model, but it's as they have gone and become more global and moved into more markets, the the Koreans working for these companies are very global today. To be hired in Korea by a major Korean group, most of the new entry-level employee has a global education. They've been educated overseas. They've acquired an international MBA. They speak uh, several languages in addition to English, not unusual. So I think that the companies themselves, at least their overseas divisions, have really embraced globalism and what that represents.
Hmm. Hmm. Are there still some nuances that Westerners today don't understand? What are those, if you might elaborate a little bit on your work?
Well, I think that everyone, I think that when we're talking about a Korean-based company that goes global, that means that as they go into the local market, they need to staff and they need to acquire local workers, um, and all up and down, from say rank and file all the way to the local leadership. Um, they're individuals, though. They're people, and their skill levels can vary. So when we talk about nuances of understanding Korean culture, um, I think it's a very individual. There are people being hired today that work for Korean-based companies overseas who've worked for Korean companies or Japanese companies or German companies, very international. But there's also people that go to work for those companies that have never worked for a international company before. So I think it's
Mm.
more. I think it's less to do today, 2015, with understanding the nuances of Korean culture, as much as the individual where they are and how open-minded they are. Um, I do a lot of training programs for these companies, and it's surprising how many of those have become students of Korean culture. They love Korean food. They listen to Korean pop. So I think there's a little different. I think there's a little different awareness today than there were. But with that all said, there are some that it's no two people are the same. Some are much more open to embracing other cultures, um, more studious. Others, for some reason, think that um, uh, I'll sort of go along with them for a while, and then but then we'll do it my way, And I think that sort of can be a a poor path to take.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing a little bit is as Korean companies become more international and more global, and as they are,
Hmm.
the internal culture will also be changing and
Hmm.
will evolve into more of an international
Hmm.
company working culture.
Hmm.
Do you see that you would still need a form of Korean cross-cultural understanding to still succeed in
Oh yeah.
those environments?
Exactly, and because we have a wide spectrum of, and what's one of the things you ask about what's changed, we have extremes. We have some of these global Korean brands like Hyundai and Kia and Samsung and LG that have been in the international market for decades now. We have a whole new wave of Korean companies entering the market. So just in Manhattan, around the corner, Cafe Baguette, which is SPC,
Hmm.
Cafe Benet up on Broadway.
Hmm.
So we have a whole new thing, and so I think it's going to be a shift in what their needs are.
Hmm.
Um, Plus, there's also within these companies, there's always a succession of people coming and going. I mean, the U.S. workforce, the Western workforce, as people come and go. And so there's always a new group of people coming in. So luckily on my side, there's always a new group of people being hired. There are new firms taking over this business. But I think that to more directly answer your question, I think there'll be less need for the major Korean brands that are highly established. But as a new wave of Korean companies come forward, they're going to be going through this same learning curve and need support.
Hmm. Great. Let's talk about your recent book release, The
Hmm.
Career Perspective.
Hmm.
This is meant to be a roadmap
Hmm.
to overcome obstacles, and you outline some strategies in the book. So could you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. And you and I sat here a few years ago, and I was
That's right.
talking about another book we did called Korea Facing. What I tried to do in this was go a little bit deeper and looked at a few themes and provide some scenarios for those. So the book is very thematic, chapter by chapter, sort of looking at some things. So, for example, there's a chapter in there about that I talk a lot about um, the processes that Westerners do to when they're engaged in a project versus Korean style.
Mm.
Um, so there's some methodology that in the Western workplace, whether it be in America or Germany or England, there's a process by which they would tackle a project, um, and many, and I talk about it in here, many these Americans will say who've worked for even multinational companies now work for Korean-based companies, and they say, "Hey, this is an entirely different process. In fact, there is no process. It's we're used to sort of these steps and things, and um, the things very different. And so I talk about that in there as why is it different. In the if we look at the German model, which is, or even Japanese business model, very systematic, laid out over a long period of time, many steps and sort of benchmarks and milestones. The Korean process is ever changing, and there's cultural reasons for this. It's also one of their competitive advantages. They don't want to get locked into something
Mhm.
uh, like that. Also, I talk about here culturally. We talk about Korea. It's much more of an interconnected workplace where things that can impact. I'll just give one scenario to that. Last year we had that awful tragedy, the Sowal ferry tragedy.
Yes.
First anniversary of it was just a few days ago.
Mhm.
But that had a tremendous impact on the Korean workplace. I mean, there were people that had projects that were lined up and moving forward, business endeavors that all sort of slowed down or were impacted by that. And sometimes that's hard in the Western workplace because we have tragedies here. I mean, that every day. I mean, it happens, but it doesn't have the impact maybe. And it's because of the interconnectedness of the society and the workplace and the people. So a lot of times in books like this, I try to share, that there's other dynamics that can impact a decision, an agreement, a contract, a project beyond just business.
Mhm. I found it interesting also you mentioned in terms of titles
Hmm.
and workplace titles
Hmm.
and how much they matter
Hmm.
in terms of lining up key management
Hmm.
principles on both sides of
Hmm.
the Western
Hmm.
company
Hmm.
doing the project with the Korean counterpart. So could you talk a little bit more about that and if you had any
Hmm.
examples or scenarios you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah, uh, Korean culture is very rooted in Confucianism. Confucianism had a social hierarchy. Um, Adding to this long, deeply rooted Confucianist tradition of Korea, we also had authoritarian regimes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, military regimes. And military regimes tend to be also very hierarchical. Um, and so the Korean workplace really had a lot of this type of a very strong rooting in a pyramid-shaped sort of workplace ideology. What do I mean by that? People at the top, people in the middle, people at the bottom.
Mm,
And at some level, mobility moving up over time, uh, and up and then out at some point. So um, it's very important matching who the teams are and like that. So the scenario I gave in there, I was representing a large U.S. brand that was very eager to go into the Korean market. And I was in a conversation with them, and I said, "Who are you talking with?" And they said, "Well, we're talking with, Miss Shin. She's very competent. She's very, organized." And I asked, and this was on the American side, the CFO, COO of the company, and so he was handling all international licensing and global licensing in, I think, probably 50 countries at that point. So
mm,
very savvy, very knowledgeable. Um, in the conversation, Mike was, "Well, who are you dealing with in Korea for your Korean partner?" And they were dealing with a major Korean entity. So it was, I felt the partnership was strong on, who the two entities were. Um, but so he actually said, "Well," I said, he said he had the business card. So I said, "Well, scan it and send me the business card." And I looked at it, and she was a dairy, which is a assistant manager. And someone's laughing here because a dairy is relatively low level. Um, but I said, well, the impasse you have, you're a, CFO, COO, senior vice president, and you're dealing with someone like that. Now, she is reporting to up the ladder, and she's reporting to people of importance. But there was a mismatch there, and I just said, and I felt less on the side, on the Korean side. It was just on his side. He just didn't realize who he was dealing with, and so I just said, "Hey, we just need to align things better. Why don't we schedule a trip for you to go to Korea through Miss Shin? She can make all the arrangements with with a comparable person. They actually then met at the right level, and everything continued to move forward. But he was sort of unaware of who he was dealing with, you know.
Was that because her title just didn't say what it was, or?
He just didn't have he had no awareness,
I
he
see.
had no awareness of where she was, and that was my first question,
Mhm,
what was her title, or
mhm,
what, uh, uh, she's since been promoted a number of times, so this was a couple years ago, so she's moved forward very well, which is
mhm,
the mobility in these Korean-based companies. But I also had another example. Was one time I was working with a large American manufacturing company that was providing product to a major Korean entity. So definitely, again, two very large entities. He just was having problem after problem, and so I had visited their manufacturing plant in the U.S., which he oversaw. It was a
mhm,
huge complex, huge complex. But on his business card, it had his name and general manager, because in his work sector in the U.S., the the title of the person running these large complexes is a general manager. Well, frankly, what the problem with was is that I would say, well, actually, your title's probably at least a vice president, if not, a senior vice president. If we were to line that up with the comparable position in Korea. Um, and again, he was always being sort of put with a chajang, which is a deputy general manager, and so he's interacting with people at a relatively, and that's sort of a middle level management. It's definitely a good managerial position, but because his card and his title within the American entity was general manager. It just that was and he needed to be dealing with someone much higher, and so we actually on his next trip updated his card for there and made it more appropriate. I think it was senior vice president. Slash general manager of
mhm,
this facility. So again, these things matter just in the social interaction,
mhm.
so.
So your book is really targeted for Westerners working for
Mhm,
Korean corporations.
mhm,
When you talk about the triangle
mhm, mm,
organizational
mhm,
structure,
mm,
many of us in MBA programs and
mhm,
graduates of
mhm.
MBA programs, we talk a lot about vertical integration
Sure.
and cross-functioning teams.
Mhm.
So is that also part of the Korean company structure here? Is it a meld of both structures here? For example, Samsung operating in the US, employing a great deal of Americans working there.
Mhm.
How does that sort of play?
It varies so much here, and it varies among different Korean companies. We'll use different models. Their sales and marketing organizations will follow the local management structure. Manufacturing tends to follow more the Korean model, um, and so it can vary a lot within companies. And so a lot of times, my investigation when I'm working with a new company is I have to get in there and sort of see, well, how are you doing things?
Mhm,
There's also shadow organizations, and the shadow organization is that you might have this large Korean-based company here with an American or Western, hierarchy, and then embedded in that you have the expatriates, and we call those Jujewan, and they are going to be following many of their Korean. They don't manage and operate the company here, but they report back to Korea. So many of us that are working in Korean-based companies find that there is sort of this sort of dual organization going on. But even that can vary because some of the Korean companies still maintain that. Within their own divisions, within, let's say, America, they might have divisions where they've eliminated all the Jujewan positions, and if you are Korean here, you are a manager embedded working just alongside with your American counterpart.
mhm,
So it can vary a lot, and so um, it takes some discovery and it takes some expertise to uncover this because on the surface, it might appear the same thing applies everywhere. But
mhm. Great. Um,
oh, can I just add to that?
yeah,
It
sure.
varies in Korea too today. So some Koreans companies are being more progressive. Naturally, the more traditional hierarchical companies like Samsung and Hyundai and Kia, you see less of that. But there are divisions within their companies, and there are some Korean-based companies that have become much more following a Western model, and I don't mean American model necessarily as a Western model.
Mm,
One of those might be that you don't have to show up until 10 a.m. in the morning, you know, um, versus being there at 8 a.m. So that the workplace environment can be very different in different Korean companies today.
Mhm.
Again, less so within the big Korean, the chaebol and the groups. But so we do see some of this occurring,
Mhm.
um, and um, there are Korean companies that I would say, are becoming very progressive.
Mhm.
Not all, but some.
That's interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about the companies that you're helping break into the U.S. market.
Sure.
Why are they interested in
hmm
expanding into the
hmm
U.S. market? What are some barriers of entry that they're facing?
hmm Again, I think that there's sort of a spectrum that we need to be aware of. The large multinational Korean companies have been highly established. They've been in the, Hyundai Motor has been in this market since '86. Kia '94. Samsung over the years has been here many years. LG. Um, there are a number of small Korean companies that are trying to do market entry here, but there's also what I think is sort of an interesting phenomena, is that there are some of the other major Korean groups. And if we look at Korean across the board of the Korean, corporate world, I mean, there's probably 40 major Korean companies. We're only normally seeing about 3 or 4 here. So there's this new wave, and I just mentioned again, if you look at brands like Paris Baguette around the corner, that's SPC, Korea's largest food brand, basically, or they're making that. Cafe Benet, one of the phenomenally successful waffle and coffee franchises in Korea, has started U.S. market entry. So there's going to be, I think, what we're going to start seeing is a second wave of highly successful Korean brands that have dominated and they control considerable market shares in Korea, but they need to then expand outside the East Asia market. And we're going to see that wave come through very soon. And so I'm very interested in that, and I'm very focused on that. Um, my most recent study is actually on, I hope they don't all go through the same learning curve that the other brands did. And unfortunately, what I've been studying so far is most of them are making a lot of the same mistakes,
Mm.
and so, you know, uh, the, hopefully, and I'm doing a lot of writing on that right now. Hopefully, that they'll read the writing and say, hey, you don't have to do the same things that some of the other Korean companies have gone through. So.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what those lessons learned might be?
One of the worst case scenarios is that many times they'll send a team over here, and of Jujewan, and they'll come in and try to do market entry, and there's and they sometimes are the best and the brightest of the company in Korea, and so they were highly successful. They did very well there. They might have even done well regionally within East Asia, and then they'll come into the U.S. market. And the U.S. market is so sophisticated in many ways. I mean, it's just, that even major U.S. companies that want to enter into a new sector don't always succeed, because it's just so specialized.
Hmm.
So what I've seen it happen in the past is sometimes they'll send a small team over here, and they hope they can just like that. Unfortunately, a lot of times they'll go into the Korean American community and think that, well, we'll get it operating well within the Korean American community, whether in, let's say, K-Town in Korea or in LA or something. Um, and that's not really the approach. I think there are other success models that they can follow.
Hmm.
So that would be maybe I would advise against that.
Right.
Just hoping that that team is going to come over here, and because they're really smart and they're really bright, and they are, and I support many of them, but it's much more sophisticated coming into the market here.
Hmm. So we've done a nice series on
Yeah.
entrepreneurship and
hmm
Korean startups.
hmm
What is your perspective on startups in Korea and the startup boom in Korea?
One of my areas of study is the whole startup sector, and it's an interesting phenomenon even here in the States. There are areas of the country that are hubs of startup. There's a lot of cities, and there are a lot of areas of the states that want to go and attract more startup. And so I think it's a culture. And those of us in the room here and listening to this tape, we're all sensitive to culture. That's why we're so in tune, and that's why the Korea Society does such a great job sharing Korean culture and the nuances of it. Um, Startup is a culture. You have to have a dynamics that goes with that. Uh, uh, I think that one of the challenges is that how do you transplant some of that culture that creates that here into Korea? There's not going to be a lack of money, though. So money is not, I think, the component of that. Um, in the past, a lot of the startup has been really within, if there's startups, that it's usually within the large groups. So this has to be more independent. It has to be more sort of grassroots. Um, so I think that it's less it's less an aspect of the money being there. It's just you have to create a culture for that. And um, there's a lot of encouragement in Korea. The current president, Park, has been very interested in creating this creative economy.
Hmm.
Uh, there are areas like Songdo, which have been sort of built around sort of this bringing some different ways of looking at business
Hmm.
to Korea. Koreans are very entrepreneurial by nature. So I think that there's going to be there's a large group of Koreans who say, hey, this is something that we need to get more involved in. Uh, but there's got to be a synergy. And the pockets of the U.S. where startups are the most successful, whether it be in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, Denver has a large startup community right today. There's a critical mass you have to create for that, and I think that's really one of the things that needs to occur over there.
Okay, if not, I'd like to thank Donald
Mhm.
Southerton. Please join me in
음.
thanking him for his presentation.
감사합니다.